The sun was shining brightly in the sky, casting a warm glow over the busy downtown streets. People hustled and bustled, going about their daily activities. There was a sense of calm mixed with the normal chaos of city life. On the sidewalk, a man of African descent was casually walking, his hands tucked into his pockets. He wasn't in any hurry, just lost in his thoughts as he strolled past cafes and shops. His brown jacket and worn-out jeans made him look like just another face in the crowd. But to him, this moment of peace was all he needed, a break from the noise of the world. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice how often people seemed to glance his way. It wasn't that he was paranoid, but living in a city meant you were always aware of your surroundings. He had grown used to the occasional suspicious glance, the whispers behind his back, but it didn't bother him. He had learned to brush it off. What bothered him, however, was the nagging feeling that something was off that afternoon. From the corner of his eye, he saw a police officer standing near the crosswalk. The officer was tall, wearing a black uniform, and scanning the crowd. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The officer's gaze lingered on him, sharp and direct, like he had been looking for someone. The man tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and quickened his pace, hoping to make it to the park at the end of the block, where he could sit for a while and enjoy a bit of peace. But as he reached the corner of the street, the officer took a step forward. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, and his tone was firm when he spoke. "Hey, you," the officer called out. "Stop right there." The man froze, his heart racing. He wasn't sure why the officer was talking to him, but something in the officer's voice made him feel like he had done something wrong, even though he hadn't. The man turned slowly to face the officer, his mind already running through a list of things he might have done to deserve this attention. Had he bumped into someone by mistake? Was it the way he was walking? He stood still, trying to figure out why he was being stopped. The officer approached him with a serious look on his face, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read something the man couldn't see. "You're under suspicion for assault," the officer said, his voice cutting through the noise of the city. "We have reports of someone matching your description who attacked a person nearby. You're coming with me." The man blinked in confusion. Assault? What was this about? He opened his mouth to protest, to explain that he had been walking peacefully, minding his own business, but the officer's hand went up, silencing him before he could speak. The street around them seemed to quiet as the officer continued to stare at him, waiting for him to react. The man's thoughts were racing. He wanted to argue, to demand to know why he was being treated like this, but he knew better than to escalate things. People were already starting to notice, a few of them glancing over, wondering what was going on. His heart pounded in his chest, and the heat of embarrassment began to rise up his neck. It was as if the weight of the officer's accusation was bearing down on him, and he didn't know what to do or how to fix it. He tried to speak again, this time more calmly, but the officer wasn't having it. He was determined, focused. His eyes were cold, like he had already made up his mind. The man felt a knot in his stomach. How had this happened? What had he done to deserve being accused of something so serious? The man stood there, still in shock, as the officer's words echoed in his mind. Assault. The word felt so heavy, so out of place in the moment. He couldn't understand why he was being accused of something he hadn't done. His hands instinctively clenched into fists, but he quickly relaxed them, reminding himself to stay calm. He didn't want to make the situation worse. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say or do next. Why was this happening to him? He took a deep breath and looked the officer in the eye, trying to make his voice steady. "I didn't do anything. I'd just been walking down the street," he said, his voice soft but firm. But the officer didn't seem to listen. Instead, the officer's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, as if inspecting him more closely, as if trying to see through him. "You're coming with me," the officer repeated, his voice colder this time. He didn't offer any explanation, just a simple demand. The man felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. It wasn't just the words. It was the way the officer said them. There was no hesitation, no room for negotiation. The officer was convinced, and there was nothing the man could say to change his mind. His legs felt heavy, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he should resist or just comply. He thought about walking away, but something inside him told him that might make things worse. So he stood there, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of it all. A part of him wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but he knew better. He had seen how things could go wrong when people made a scene, especially with someone in authority. He wasn't sure if that was what the officer was looking for, but he knew he had to be careful. The man glanced around. People were starting to take notice, some even stopping to watch. He could feel their eyes on him. Some looked concerned, others just curious. But there were no signs of help. He was on his own in this. He swallowed hard, trying to push back the panic that was threatening to rise up in his chest. He couldn't afford to lose his composure now. He had to stay calm, even though everything in him screamed that this wasn't right. "I'm telling you, I didn't do anything," he said again, a little louder this time. His voice was still shaking, but he couldn't help it. His heart was beating faster now, and it felt like his throat was tightening. The officer just stared at him, unblinking, as if he were waiting for the man to say something else, anything that would give him a reason to act. Then something strange happened. The officer paused, just for a second, and looked over his shoulder. For a brief moment, the man saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was almost as if the officer was considering something, wondering if he had made a mistake. But the moment passed quickly, and the officer's expression turned cold again. He wasn't backing down. The man could feel the heat rising in his face. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had never imagined he would be standing here, accused of something so serious when he knew he had done nothing wrong. The feeling of injustice began to settle deep in his chest. He felt trapped, but he still couldn't bring himself to do anything rash. He had to trust that things would work out. They had to. The man stood there, his mind racing as the officer's cold stare never wavered. The world around him felt like it was shrinking. The noise of the city, the chatter of people, the sound of cars passing by, all of it faded into the background. All that mattered now was the officer's words, the accusation of assault. His stomach twisted into knots. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a mistake. Something wasn't right. But what could he do? He wasn't the kind of person to make a scene, and he knew resisting wouldn't help. People were still watching. He could feel their eyes on him. Some curious, some confused. He wondered if they were thinking the same thing. Was this really happening? Was this man really being accused of something he didn't do? The silence between him and the officer stretched on. The officer's gaze remained unwavering, his hands still resting on his belt. It was as if he were waiting for the man to crack, to show any sign of guilt or fear. But the man wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. He just kept his head high, trying to stay composed, though inside, his thoughts were a whirlwind. "I've already told you, I didn't do anything," the man said again, his voice steadier now, though still laced with frustration. He had tried to stay calm at first, but now, the weight of the accusation felt like a heavy burden pressing down on him. How could the officer be so sure? There had to be a mistake. The man's mind worked in overdrive, replaying every moment since he had walked down the street. Had he done something to make the officer think he was a criminal? He couldn't come up with anything. Nothing made sense. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the bystanders around them, probably searching for someone to back up his claim. The man's eyes shifted too, but no one stepped forward. The crowd was silent, perhaps unsure of what was happening. It wasn't as though anyone had seen what the officer saw, but no one seemed willing to speak up either. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, and the man could feel his anxiety rise. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to steady himself. He needed to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control now. His hands were shaking, but he forced them to stay still. He looked the officer in the eye, trying to let him know that he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't guilty of anything. But the officer wasn't looking at him anymore. Instead, he was looking past him, scanning the street as if the man's innocence didn't matter. The officer was too focused on his own version of events to see what was right in front of him. The man felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He wasn't going to be treated like this. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a street, accused of something he couldn't even comprehend. He tried again, his voice a little more forceful this time. "Please, I haven't done anything. Just ask anyone around here. I'm not the one you're looking for." He felt his throat tighten as the words left his mouth. The crowd was still silent, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of their stares, wondering if they believed him or not. But the officer remained unmoved, his face a mask of determination. He wasn't listening. It didn't matter how many times the man repeated himself. The officer had already made up his mind. The man took another deep breath, his mind screaming for a way out. He couldn't be stuck in this moment forever. Something had to change. The tension in the air was thick, and the man could feel it pulling at him, making it harder to breathe. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to take another deep breath. He couldn't lose control. He had to stay calm, even though everything in him screamed to do something, anything, to make this stop. The officer's eyes were locked on him, unblinking, like he was trying to catch him in a lie, trying to find something in his expression that would prove he was guilty of what was being claimed. But there was nothing. For a moment, the officer glanced away, shifting his gaze toward the crowd. The man felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe the officer would finally see the truth, or maybe someone would speak up and tell the officer that he was making a mistake. But the seconds stretched on, and no one moved. No one said anything. It was as if everyone was just waiting for this strange, uncomfortable situation to pass, and the man realized that he might be on his own. He couldn't rely on the crowd to speak for him. His mind raced. What had gone wrong? He kept replaying the events in his head, trying to figure out what had triggered this whole thing. Had he looked at the officer wrong? Was there something about the way he walked, the way he held himself, that had made him stand out in a bad way? He thought about the police officer, who now appeared to be distracted by something in the crowd. Was the officer beginning to second-guess himself? The briefest flicker of doubt in his eyes made the man wonder if he might finally be able to break free of this impossible situation. The officer's hand rested lightly on his belt, and he shifted his stance, taking a slow step back. The man thought he might be ready to let him go, but before he could speak again, something else happened. Another officer, one who had been walking a few paces behind, arrived on the scene. She was tall, her expression serious but calm, her eyes scanning the situation. She looked at the officer, then at the man, and something in her gaze seemed different. She didn't look at him with suspicion, like the first officer. She simply looked at him like he was just another person in the crowd, just another citizen going about his day. The man couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief when she arrived. Maybe she would see the situation for what it was, a misunderstanding. Maybe she could help him get out of this mess. But she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she approached the first officer, lowering her voice as she asked him what had happened. The man couldn't hear the conversation, but he watched the way the officer responded. His shoulders were tense, and there was something about his posture that made the man think he was trying to explain himself, maybe even make an excuse for his actions. The second officer listened carefully, but the man could see that her gaze shifted toward him, as if she were trying to piece together the story. Then, for a brief moment, her eyes locked with his. The look was brief but telling. She seemed to understand something the first officer hadn't noticed, something about the way the man stood there, calm and unafraid. She didn't make any snap judgments like the first officer had. Instead, She was processing everything, carefully evaluating the situation. And that's when the first officer, still standing tense and unmoving, seemed to falter. The second officer was now the one in control, her presence suddenly commanding. The man stood there, waiting for her to make a decision, hoping that she would see the truth. His heart still raced, but he was beginning to feel that perhaps things might turn around. This new officer might just be the change he needed. The second officer, with her calm yet attentive demeanor, turned her attention fully to the situation. The first officer, still standing awkwardly, seemed to be waiting for some sort of confirmation, unsure of how to proceed. The man could see the slight shift in the second officer's posture. She didn't seem rushed, didn't seem to have already made up her mind like the first officer had. Instead, she took a moment to assess the entire scene, looking back at the man, then glancing around, taking in everything. The man stood there, unsure of what would happen next, but with a small glimmer of hope. He watched as the second officer glanced at the crowd, and he could tell she was piecing things together in her mind. He knew that this might be his only chance to prove he was innocent, to show that he wasn't the person they were looking for. But what if it didn't work? What if she still sided with the first officer? He couldn't afford to be stuck here any longer. "Can you tell me exactly what happened here?" the second officer asked, her tone soft but firm. She didn't make accusations, didn't raise her voice. She simply asked the man to explain himself. For the first time since the encounter began, the man felt like someone was actually listening. It was a small thing, but it made all the difference. He took a breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I was just walking down the street. I didn't do anything. I'm not the person you're looking for." He felt like he was speaking the truth, but the way the officer was looking at him made him feel like there was still a chance. Her eyes were focused, thoughtful, and she didn't rush to judge him. She turned slightly, exchanging a few quiet words with the first officer. The man couldn't hear what was being said, but it didn't matter. The way the second officer was handling the situation was enough. She didn't act like she had already made up her mind, like it was a done deal. After a brief pause, the second officer turned back to him. "Can you tell me what you were doing before this?" The man nodded. "I was just walking. I didn't know anything was wrong until he stopped me." The second officer seemed to consider his words carefully, but then her gaze shifted once again. She looked down the street, scanning the crowd, her eyes alert. And that's when something in the background caught her attention. The real suspect, the one who had been involved in the assault, had been trying to blend in with the crowd. He had been watching the scene unfold from a distance, but as soon as he realized the officers were starting to focus on the man, he panicked. The second officer noticed the shift in his body language, how he was trying to retreat, how he was moving with a sense of urgency. Without a word, the second officer nodded to her partner. The first officer didn't hesitate this time. He immediately began moving toward the man who had been trying to slip away, recognizing him now for what he truly was. The man watched as the first officer quickly closed the distance. It was happening so fast, but for the first time in the past few minutes, the man felt a weight lift from his chest. The focus had shifted, and it wasn't on him anymore. As the first officer closed in on the real suspect, the second officer turned back to the man who had been wrongly accused. She gave him a look, one of silent understanding, as if to say that she knew he hadn't been the one to commit the crime. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He felt a flicker of relief, a small moment of victory that didn't feel like an end, but a beginning. The officer who had originally accused him looked visibly uncomfortable now, his eyes avoiding the man's gaze. He had been so sure, so confident that the man was guilty, but the truth had come to light in a matter of moments, and in those few minutes, everything had changed. The real assailant was quickly apprehended, and the second officer approached the man once again. This time, her demeanor was different, gentler, more reassuring. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," she said. "We'll make sure this is all cleared up." The man nodded, though his frustration still lingered. He wasn't sure if the apology would make everything feel right. But for the first time, he felt like he had been heard. The weight of the situation hadn't fully lifted, but at least now he knew that things would be set straight. The real culprit was caught, and his innocence was finally recognized. The air still felt tense, but it was starting to lift, slowly. The first officer, who had been so certain of the man's guilt, stood awkwardly to the side, his gaze shifting nervously from the man to the second officer. The real suspect had been caught, and it was clear that the situation had turned in the man's favor, but the tension wasn't entirely gone. He could feel the eyes of the crowd still on him, still watching, some with curiosity, others with judgment. His heart was still racing, and his mind was in a haze, but there was a quiet sense of relief now. The second officer, the one who had treated him with respect, approached him again, this time with a more understanding look in her eyes. "I know this must have been very stressful for you," she said, her voice softer now, less formal. The man nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. His throat felt tight. It was strange. He had never imagined that a simple walk down the street could lead to something like this. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of the past few minutes had settled into his bones. I didn't know what to think," he finally said, his voice shaky but clear. "I didn't do anything wrong, and I was just trying to walk down the street. I didn't understand why I was being stopped." He glanced over at the first officer, who was still standing off to the side, his face flushed with embarrassment. The first officer didn't seem to know where to look, his eyes darting around, avoiding both the man and the second officer. The man couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction at the officer's discomfort. It wasn't right, but after everything that had just happened, he couldn't deny that a small part of him felt like this was justice, even if it was an awkward, uncomfortable one. "I understand," the second officer said, "and we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. You shouldn't have been put in this position in the first place." She paused, letting her words sink in. The mistake was made, and it was addressed quickly. She gestured over to the real suspect, who was now in handcuffs, sitting on the curb with another officer standing guard. "That's the person we should have been focused on, not you." The man sighed, the air feeling easier to breathe now, but there was still a gnawing feeling inside of him. It wasn't just the discomfort of the situation. It was the realization that he had been judged unfairly. His chest tightened again as he thought about how quickly the officer had acted to accuse him, without even bothering to listen to him or check the facts. The man had spent the last few minutes feeling helpless, trapped in a situation where his word didn't seem to matter at all. The second officer seemed to sense his discomfort. "I'm sorry this happened," she said again. "I know an apology doesn't fix everything, but it's all I can offer right now. We will file a report about what happened and make sure it's all cleared up." The man nodded again, though the words didn't ease his mind. "I just don't understand how something like this could happen," he said, more to himself than to her. "I was just walking down the street." "I know," the officer said quietly, "and you shouldn't have been treated like this." There was something in her voice, genuine, regretful, that made the man feel like she really understood, like she wasn't just offering words to appease him. It was rare to find that kind of empathy, especially from someone in authority. It made him feel, for the first time in a long while, that not everyone would judge him based on his appearance or make assumptions about who he was. As the officers worked to wrap things up, the man took a few steps back, his mind still processing everything that had just happened. He had been caught in the middle of a storm he never saw coming, and though it was over, the aftermath lingered in the air. The relief he felt was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, a system that sometimes jumped to conclusions without truly understanding the situation. A part of him wondered how many others had been through similar situations, where the truth was overlooked and assumptions were made. For now, though, the most important thing was that it was over. The real culprit was caught, and he had been cleared. He felt a weight lifted from his shoulders, but the lesson remained. He walked away with a quiet resolve, knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, things really did work out. As the scene started to settle down, The man stood on the sidewalk, watching the officers handle the real suspect. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically, and he could feel the last of the tension slowly leaving his body. He glanced around once more, noticing how some people who had been watching earlier now carried on with their day as though nothing had happened. It was strange how quickly everything seemed to return to normal. But for him, this moment would linger for a long time, a reminder of how quickly life could take an unexpected turn. The first officer, still standing off to the side, glanced at him briefly, but there was no more confidence in his stance. The man couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. After everything, the fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, he had been proven innocent. But it wasn't the victory he had imagined. There was no grand moment of justice. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of world. The second officer, the one who had actually listened to him, now stood beside him, her tone calm and reassuring. "Thank you for staying calm through all of this," she said again, her voice soft but sincere. "I know this wasn't easy for you." The man nodded, but words felt like they were stuck in his throat. The shock of the situation still hadn't fully worn off. "I didn't know what to think," he said quietly. "It all happened so fast." He shook his head slowly, still processing everything. "I never thought something like this would happen to me. Not in a million years." His voice trailed off, the weight of the experience sinking in more deeply with each passing second. "I understand," the officer said, her expression sympathetic. "And I promise you, we'll make sure this is all addressed properly." She paused for a moment, looking at the first officer who had made the mistake. "It won't happen again. I'll make sure of that." The man wasn't sure if her words made him feel better or not. How could anyone promise something like that? How could anyone guarantee that things wouldn't go wrong in the future? He wanted to believe her, but after what he had just experienced, it was hard to trust that the system would always work the way it should. He had seen firsthand how quickly things could go off course, how assumptions could be made without checking the facts. It had shaken him more than he was willing to admit. He glanced back at the real suspect, who was now being taken away in handcuffs. The man couldn't help but feel a bit of relief. The real culprit was being dealt with. Justice was being served, and the threat was over. But there was still a lingering sense of unease. The way he had been treated, the way he had been wrongly accused, was still fresh in his mind. It wasn't something that would just disappear. How could it? He had been made to feel like he was guilty, even when he knew he wasn't. As the officers finished up their paperwork, the man took one last look at the scene. He could hear the faint sound of cars passing by, the chatter of pedestrians, the normal rhythm of the city returning. But for him, it felt like a different world now. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were never truly as simple as they seemed. People made mistakes, but sometimes those mistakes had consequences that couldn't just be undone with an apology. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The situation was over. The suspect had been caught, and he had been cleared. It should have felt like closure. It should have felt like the end of a story. But it didn't. Instead, it felt like a lesson. A reminder of how fragile things could be. A reminder that sometimes the world could be unpredictable, and that no one was ever fully immune from the unexpected. As he turned and began walking away, he knew one thing for sure. He would never look at the world the same way again. This experience, no matter how small it seemed in the grand scheme of things, had changed something inside of him. And though he didn't know exactly what the future would hold, he now understood the importance of standing up for the truth, even when it seemed like no one would listen. As the man continued walking down the street, the weight of everything that had happened slowly began to settle within him. His mind was still racing, processing the events of the last hour, the feeling of being accused for something he didn't do, the confusion, the fear, all of it replayed in his mind like a loop. It wasn't just about the wrongful accusation. It was about the system, the way things could go wrong so quickly, and how fragile one's innocence could seem in the face of misunderstanding. He knew it wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about how he had been treated. It was about the bigger picture. What about all the other people who found themselves in similar situations, where they weren't as lucky as he had been? What about those whose voices went unheard, or those who were wrongly judged without anyone taking the time to listen? The thought made his chest tighten. He couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change, that these kinds of things couldn't keep happening to people who didn't deserve it. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but the man couldn't help but feel like he was still under the spotlight, even though the immediate tension was gone. As he walked, he passed by the same storefronts, the same cafes, the same streets that had once felt so familiar, but now they felt foreign, as if he were seeing them for the first time. His feet carried him forward without much thought, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The reality of what had happened was still hard to accept. A few blocks down, he stopped at a bench in the park, needing a moment to gather his thoughts. He sat there for a while, letting the city continue around him, its rhythm unaffected by the storm that had just passed through his life. People walked by, couples laughed, children played in the distance, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the streets. It should have felt peaceful, but the man's thoughts wouldn't let him rest. He thought about the officer who had wrongly accused him. The first officer had made a mistake, yes, but it was more than that. He had acted on assumptions without fully investigating, without taking the time to listen. The second officer had been the one to see the truth, the one to recognize the man's innocence. It was a small, quiet victory, but the man understood that not everyone got that same chance. He thought about how lucky he had been, how lucky it had been that the second officer had arrived when she did, that she had listened when the first officer hadn't. But what if she hadn't been there? What if the first officer had been even more determined to prove his point? He shuddered at the thought. He wasn't sure what would have happened, but he knew that the outcome could have been different. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how fragile it all was. As he sat there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from a friend asking how his day was going. The question seemed so out of place after everything that had happened. He sat for a moment, staring at the screen, unsure of how to respond. How could he explain the strange mix of relief and frustration he was feeling? How could he put into words the feeling of having been judged by someone who hadn't bothered to truly understand? He typed a quick reply, telling his friend he was okay, just a little shaken, but that it was all over now. He hit send, then leaned back against the bench, looking up at the sky. The day was fading into evening, and the world was moving on, as it always did. He knew that, eventually, he would move on too. But for now, he would sit here for a while longer, taking the time to reflect on what had happened and what it meant for him. The experience had left him with more questions than answers, but it had also opened his eyes. He had learned that sometimes the truth wasn't so easily seen, that it wasn't always the loudest voices that told the story. And he knew now, more than ever, how important it was to speak up, to stand up for yourself when things weren't right. Even in the most uncertain of times, you had to trust in the truth, because sometimes it was the truth that would guide you out of the darkness and into the light. With a deep breath, he stood up from the bench, his steps steady but his mind still swirling. The evening air was cool, but he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the road ahead would be different now. Things had changed, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could face it all with a little more strength.